Good morning. We have some sun in the UK, which is, for me, absolutely breaking news. But that's obviously not the reason for this video. Okay, last week, a clinical psychologist kindly invited me to speak on a panel about corporate compassion in the age of AI. Now, I'm not sure how much wisdom I can impart there, but obviously nice to be asked. I guess there would be some discussions about whether companies have moral obligations beyond profit, and I guess it was going to be, I guess largely theoretical, right? But then last week happened, and suddenly it's not theoretical anymore. So what am I talking about? Well, you may have already seen the US government has used emergency style powers and threats against Anthropic, who are, of course, an American AI company. And they've used tools that were usually designed for foreign adversaries. So I'm in the UK kind of watching all of this unfold. And I guess my interest isn't just about America. This is about precedents. So here's what happened in those 72 hours. And this is why you should care and why it should probably scare you no matter where you live. Let's get into it. Right, in the middle of last week, the Pentagon had given Anthropic a pretty brutal choice. Agree by Friday at 5:01 p.m. Eastern to let the military use its models for all lawful purposes or face being cut off and treated as a supply chain risk under the Defense Production Act. Anthropic basically was holding out on two red lines, okay? Number one, no mass domestic surveillance of Americans. Number two, no fully autonomous weapons. Everything else, pretty much fair game. They've been working with the military on classified networks as it is, right? No problems. The Pentagon wanted all lawful purposes, no exceptions. Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei, he responded in a public letter and he said Anthropic cannot in good conscience accede to abandoning its policies on lethal autonomous weapons or mass domestic surveillance and warned some AI uses undermine rather than defend democratic values. Now, on the same day, OpenAI CEO Sam Altman, he tells staff, hey, listen, we share the same red lines, okay? Anthropic's two red lines, no domestic mass surveillance, no fully autonomous weapons without human oversight. By Friday morning, a Pentagon spokesman says, here's what we're asking. Allow the Pentagon to use Anthropic's model for all lawful purposes, and goes on to say, we will not let any company dictate the terms regarding how we make operational decisions. Come Friday afternoon, Trump on Truth Social's post, the left-wing nutjobs at Anthropic have made a disastrous mistake, trying to strong-arm the Department of War and force them to obey their terms of service instead of our Constitution. Their selfishness is putting American lives at risk, our troops in danger, and our national security in jeopardy. He orders every federal agency to cease all use of Anthropic. He ordered the entire federal government to immediately cease using Anthropic's tech with a 6-month phase-out for some agencies like the Pentagon. On X, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he posts, this week, Anthropic delivered a masterclass in arrogance and betrayal. Our position has never wavered and we will never waver. The Department of War must have full, unrestricted access to Anthropic's models for every lawful purpose in defense of the Republic. He said Anthropic's stance was fundamentally incompatible with the American principles, and he ordered the Department of War to designate Anthropic a supply chain risk to national security. Now, that designation is the same kind of tool the US usually points at foreign adversaries, like Russian cyber firms, Chinese chip makers, not American AI startups. And remember, by the way, all of this is done in the public square through Truth Social and X posts. Now, here's where this gets truly wild, right? You got to remember, Claude wasn't just some sort of experimental tool on a demo laptop, right? It had already been used in live operations. Just in January this year, during the operation to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, the US military reportedly used Anthropic's model through Palantir software, right? All for real-time analysis in an active mission. And then, just hours after Trump orders the federal agencies to stop using Anthropic, reports say the US military still relied on Claude during the Iran strikes. using it in the same classified stack for intelligence assessment and planning. So let that sink in. Friday afternoon, Trump calls them left-wing nutjobs that put American lives at risk. Friday night, US Central Command, they're still leaning on Claude for intelligence assessment, target analysis, and all the wargaming scenarios in the Iran operation. The very AI they said was too dangerous to allow, too woke to trust, too much of a national security risk to do business with, was actively being used in one of the most sensitive military operations happening at that exact moment. It's ironic, but clearly it shouldn't be surprising, right? Because here's the reality. Look, at that point, Claude was the only large-scale AI system actually integrated into the US military's classified environments. Okay, Anthropic was probably the first and for a while the only AI company cleared to run foundation models on those networks. So they're not just a vendor, they were the vendor for the most sensitive work. And this was so alarming, right? Because the government's response to them holding ethical lines was to threaten them as a national security risk, while simultaneously relying on them for active combat operations. I think you literally cannot make this stuff up. So those red lines that they're holding so close to, what do they actually mean? Well, let me try and translate some of that jargon for you. Okay, line number one was mass domestic surveillance. That was a no-no for Anthropic. So right now, it's legal for the government to buy your data, right, from private companies. Your location history, your shopping patterns, your kids' social media. You, me, we all gave it to people like Facebook, Google, when we clicked I agree. And the law was written before AI could analyze millions of lives in seconds and build really detailed profiles. And Anthropic has simply said, look, some uses of AI undermine rather than defend democratic values. And one of those is building tools that make mass surveillance of citizens technically feasible when democratic oversight hasn't caught up. I mean, the law is here and the AI technology is there. They're simply not moving at the same pace. But the Pentagon said, we have no interest in using AI for domestic mass surveillance, but we still want the legal right to use these models for all lawful purposes, and then we ain't going to let a contractor dictate those limits. Red line number two, fully autonomous weapons. Now, in an interview I watched with Dario Amodei on CBS, he gives a kind of illustration on this. So it's around this kind of idea where you picture 10 million drones, there's one person controlling them, there's no human individual targeting decisions, right? The AI decides, the AI fires, no human in the loop. Anthropic said today's AI simply isn't reliable or predictable enough for fully autonomous weapons. And some uses are going to be outside of what today's technology can safely and reliably do. So anyone who works with these models, right, knows that they're unpredictable. And we haven't had a democratic conversation about whether this is acceptable either. But again, the Pentagon has said, look, tying their hands on these edge cases could jeopardize critical operations. And they cannot accept contractual limits on lawful military uses, even if they say they don't plan to deploy fully autonomous weapons right now. So in essence, the fight was over whether Anthropic could refuse to build or support AI systems for these uses, or if the government later decided they were lawful, right? Trump said Anthropic was forcing the military to obey their terms of service instead of our constitution. But look at what Anthropic are actually saying. They argue that some AI uses, right, undermine democratic values and civil liberties. And they drew a hard line against mass domestic surveillance and fully autonomous weapons because there's been no democratic mandate and oversight for all these powers yet. So if you map that onto the Constitution, we've got the Fourth Amendment, I believe, which is protections against unreasonable search. Anthropic said, in practice, mass AI surveillance undermines this. The government said, hey, listen, that's not Anthropic's call to make, and dismissed it as ideological. On democratic oversight of military force, Anthropic said, look, autonomous weapons needs a democratic and congressional debate before tech companies can help make them real. The government said, hey, that's strong arming. So what we got here is a private company saying, slow down. Let's have a democratic conversation first. The government's response? Threaten them with the Defense Production Act powers and a supply chain risk label, which we normally reserve for foreign adversaries. And then we'll announce it all on social posts. The constitutional irony is that we now live in a world where a corporate company is trying harder to uphold the Constitution than the US government. Now, this is pretty whack as well. Within about a day of the ban and the supply chain risk label, Sam Altman pops his head. He posts that OpenAI has agreed to provide its models on classified Pentagon networks, saying their deal reflects the same two principles on no domestic mass surveillance and human accountability for the use of force. That's roughly 24 hours from publicly backing Anthropic's red lines to effectively becoming their replacement provider. Wow. I mean, that's savage, right? Publicly, OpenAI's line was, hey, listen, we share Anthropic's principles, and the Pentagon has assured us those principles already exist in law and policy, so we can sign. So either Anthropic was stubborn or OpenAI accepted weaker terms. I don't know which. But what I do know is when faced with the same pressure, one company held the line through all the public ultimatums, through all the threats for 72 hours, and one signed deal in about 24. That's what corporate compassion costs, right? Where principles have a price tag. So look, I'm in the UK. This isn't my constitution, but it's a precedent, right, for how governments can treat and will treat companies, AI companies worldwide. The US government has just showed every government on earth its playbook. Lean on emergency powers, threaten supply chain risk status, blast the contractor on social media, and then will reward the rival that's willing to play ball. Now, if America can do this to its own companies for refusing to enable mass surveillance on its own civilians or fully autonomous weapons, what stops any government from doing it to companies in their country, right? Every AI CEO just learned government contracts requires obedience, not principles. This is the chilling effect in real time as we see it, right? I've been looking at AI deployment for months, the adoption gap, job impact, potential new economy, corporate claims versus reality, government scrambling to regulate what they don't really understand. But this really felt for me very different. It happened so quickly, for one, but it's like, look, the government said democratic oversight is an obstacle. Guardrails against mass surveillance and autonomous weapons are arrogance and betrayal, and corporate resistance is treated like treason. And it's done all in 72 hours, like I said, right, via tweets, no formal process. I speak at that panel, I may have to tell them, look, I watched a company show compassion for citizens' rights, and I watched their government try to destroy them. I watched their competitor choose contracts over courage. Maybe the question isn't whether corporations have compassion or should exhibit them, is whether they can afford it, right? I don't think enough people are paying attention. I mean, does this feel like defending democracy to you or something else entirely? As always, thank you so much for watching. Please hit me with your comments and thoughts on this. Super important events and a conversation that I think we should be continuing to have and observing. And I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. It supports the channel massively. In the meanwhile, be good, be kind. I'm going to go enjoy some sun. Stay human. Take it easy. Bye.